had it not been for one of the most extraordinary events of the 20th century, Mao Zedong's imposition upon China of the great proletarian cultural revolution. Now, this was just an incredibly dramatic event. If some of you don't know what it was like in microcosm to be in the middle of that, Rong Zhang's book, Wild Swans, is a wonderful illustration of how one family was caught up in the vicious political name-calling and persecution that went on. But one of the effects of the Cultural Revolution was that all religious establishments, Buddhist, Taoist, Muslim, Catholic, Protestant, were completely banned and closed down in China. And famously, or infamously, if you prefer, Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, spoke to some visiting Western reporters in 1975, and she said, "You ask about Christianity in China, that's just something for the museum." But ironically, the Cultural Revolution provided an astonishing new freedom for rural evangelists to wander from village to village quite clandestinely, providing ministry, encouragement, support to families all over China who had experienced the persecution that was endemic to the whole Cultural Revolution experience. Red Guards chased anybody who was thought to possess Christian scriptures or Buddhist scriptures or Muslim or Hindu scriptures for that matter. Sometimes Chinese Christians, who even non-clergy people, were killed, executed for possessing scriptures. But one of the things that happened during the Cultural Revolution was that rural groups of Christians began to organize themselves clandestinely, but very effectively. And so by the early 1970s, there was evidence, if you cared to pay attention to what was going on in the Chinese countryside, evidence of a very powerful rural evangelical movement taking place in China. I'll tell you about this from my personal experience. I was in Hong Kong as a reporter in the early 1970s, and that was a time when a number of Chinese were swimming out to Hong Kong as refugees. And I had the unusual experience and the privilege as a reporter of being able to triangulate the story of one refugee from the city of Fuzhou who told a story about persecution by the police of Christian activity in his city. And shortly afterwards, I met the policeman himself who had been involved in this persecution, and he had become a refugee. I mean, it's a very remarkable story. The man had an unfortunate condition of nose cancer. He claims, this is his story, that he was prayed for by the Christians whom he was persecuting, and his illness went away. Now that's very interesting, because it became apparent from anybody who was following what was going on in the 1970s that one characteristic of the growth of the Chinese church was the belief by large numbers of Chinese that health problems were successfully being dealt with by Christian groups. Now, I'm not asking you to kind of believe in miracles or anything like that. All I'm saying is, as a reporter, these are the stories that kept coming out of China. And eventually, even if the stories are not true, enough people are believing them to begin the process of becoming Christian. Well, When the Cultural Revolution came to an end and the new policy of openness and reform to the outside world was introduced by Deng Xiaoping, all of a sudden, these Chinese Christian groups found themselves operating with no clear rules for what was allowed and what was not allowed. And so for a crucial period of a few years in the late 70s and early 80s, Chinese evangelists went from village to village spreading the message of the gospel and bringing new members into their fold. And it's a very interesting story. I had the opportunity, it was a wonderful privilege to do some reporting of the church in China in 2002. And I heard the story of one network of house church groups. Was called the Tanghe Fellowship, that in 1994 in April, a very specific date, had sent out on a missionary trip to 22 of China's provinces a group of 70 young Chinese evangelists from that church. It sent them out, it gave them the equivalent in Chinese currency of about $200, and it said, come back in exactly 6 months and tell us what you've done. And I managed to find a few of these people who'd been on that particular mission trip, and they just had extraordinary stories. Some of them had gone to places like Inner Mongolia, and they found a group of 15 other Christians kind of furtively meeting with each other. And they had gone in and encouraged this group, and 10 years later, a group of 15 had now turned into a network of churches with a total membership of about 150,000. Now, this was happening all over China in the 80s and 90s. What you see happening is a rural Christian explosion